man. We're just gonna talk, okay?
Talk?
No.
Arrest it.
Do your step back, man.
Don't tell me to step back.
The security camera footage captured something that would stay with everyone who watched it for a very long time. An elderly African-American man, 71 years old, stood peacefully in the breakfast food section of a neighborhood grocery store. He was doing nothing more than examining the products on the shelf, taking his time the way older shoppers often do. Then a white woman decades younger than him began screaming at him with racial slurs so hateful that the assistant manager who witnessed it would later tell investigators she had never encountered such naked bigotry in her entire career working retail. What unfolded over the next several minutes would lead to a dramatic arrest, a courtroom battle that captivated an entire region, and financial penalties so substantial they would be discussed in legal circles for years to come. Before we go any further into this story, I want to take a moment to connect with you. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Whether you are in a big city or a small town, whether it is morning or late at night where you are, I appreciate you being here. If you have not already, consider subscribing to this channel. We work hard to bring you stories that matter, stories that make you think and feel and question the world around you. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue this work. Now, let us return to what happened on that fateful day. The incident occurred on a Wednesday afternoon at Greenfield Community Grocery, a medium-sized supermarket nestled in a peaceful residential area in Massachusetts. The store had been serving the neighborhood for nearly 35 years. It was the kind of place where the staff knew many customers by name, where families had been shopping for generations, and where people of all backgrounds had always felt welcome. The owners took pride in maintaining a warm, inclusive atmosphere. Signs near the entrance proclaimed their commitment to treating every customer like family. That welcoming spirit was shattered on September 18, 2025. In a way that no one could have anticipated. The victim of this horrific encounter was a man named Walter T. Morrison, a 71-year-old retired Navy veteran who had dedicated 12 years of his life to serving his country. After his military service, Walter had transitioned into education, spending nearly 3 decades as a high school history teacher in the local public school system. He had touched countless young lives during his teaching career, earning multiple awards for excellence in education. His former students often stopped him on the street to thank him for the impact he had made on their lives. He retired in 2017 and had been enjoying a quiet, peaceful existence with his wife of 45 years in a modest home just a few miles from the grocery store. On that particular Wednesday, Walter had decided to make a quick trip to Greenfield Community Grocery. His wife had asked him to pick up a few items for the dinner she was planning. The list was simple and unassuming. A loaf of whole wheat bread, a gallon of 2% milk, some oatmeal, and a selection of fresh vegetables for a salad. It was the kind of ordinary errand that millions of Americans complete every single day without incident. Walter had no reason to expect that this routine shopping trip would become the most traumatic experience of his later years. Walter made his way slowly through the store's aisles. He walked with the assistance of a wooden cane, a necessity following a knee replacement surgery he had undergone about 8 months earlier. The recovery had been more challenging than he anticipated, and he was still regaining his full mobility. Despite this limitation, he remained independent and insisted on doing his own shopping whenever possible. His wife often worried about him going out alone, but Walter was determined to maintain his autonomy. On this day, he wore a dark blue baseball cap adorned with a veteran's insignia, a comfortable gray cardigan sweater over a white collared shirt, and tan slacks. His appearance was neat and unremarkable. There was nothing about how he looked or how he carried himself that could reasonably be perceived as threatening or unusual in any way. The woman who would soon turn his ordinary shopping trip into a nightmare was named Margaret Holloway. She was a 43-year-old real estate agent who lived in a more affluent neighborhood about 4 miles from the grocery store. Margaret had built a moderately successful career selling homes in the area and was known among her colleagues as ambitious and sometimes difficult to work with. On this particular Wednesday, according to witnesses who observed her from the moment she entered the store, Margaret arrived in an already agitated state. A store employee later testified that she heard Margaret arguing loudly with another customer over a parking space in the lot before she even entered the building. Another witness reported seeing Margaret snap rudely at a cashier who greeted her at the entrance. Walter had made his way to the breakfast foods aisle. He stood in front of the oatmeal selection, carefully comparing the prices and nutritional information of two different brands. His reading glasses were perched on the end of his nose as he squinted at the small print on the packaging. He was in no hurry. His shopping cart was positioned beside him, and he was lost in the simple task of deciding which oatmeal to purchase. It was this scene, this completely mundane moment of an elderly man grocery shopping, that Margaret Holloway entered when she turned her cart into the same aisle. What happened in the next few seconds has been reconstructed from multiple sources: the store's security cameras, witness testimonies, and the cell phone videos that several shoppers began recording once the confrontation escalated. As Margaret maneuvered her shopping cart down the aisle, her cart made the slightest contact with Walter's cart. It was barely a touch. The kind of minor bump that happens countless times every day in every grocery store across America. The contact was so insignificant that it would not have spilled a cup of water had one been placed in either cart. Walter looked up from the oatmeal boxes immediately. His instinct, honed by decades of polite social interaction, was to apologize. Even though the fault, if any could even be assigned to such a trivial incident, was entirely unclear, Walter offered a gentle apology. His voice was soft and measured. He nodded respectfully at Margaret and began to move his cart slightly to give her more room to pass. It was exactly the response that any reasonable civilized person would have had to such a minor non-event. A smile, a nod, perhaps a brief exchange of pleasantries, and both parties would continue with their day. This is how such moments are supposed to unfold. But Margaret Holloway was not reasonable on this day. Something dark and ugly that had perhaps been lurking beneath her surface for years came roaring to life in that moment. She stopped her cart abruptly, the wheels making a sharp squeaking sound against the polished floor. She turned around slowly and fixed Walter with a stare that several witnesses would later describe as filled with pure, undiluted rage. Her face contorted into an expression of such contempt that shoppers nearby felt a chill run down their spines just witnessing it. Walter was confused by her reaction. He had apologized. He had moved out of her way. He had done everything a polite person should do in such a situation. He could not understand why this woman was looking at him as though he had committed some grievous offense against her. He nodded again, a nervous gesture this time, and tried to return to his shopping. He picked up one of the oatmeal boxes and placed it in his cart, hoping that ignoring the strange interaction would cause it to dissipate naturally. That is when Margaret began to speak. The words that came out of her mouth were captured with disturbing clarity on the store's security camera audio system. What had been an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in a suburban grocery store transformed into something far more sinister. Margaret launched into a verbal assault unlike anything the witnesses present had ever experienced in person. She used the most vile, degrading racial slurs imaginable, each word dripping with hatred and venom. She told Walter that people like him, using language far more offensive than those 3 words, did not belong in stores like this. She declared that he was dirty, dangerous, and had no business being in what she referred to as her neighborhood. Walter stood frozen in place. His hand gripped the handle of his cane so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The oatmeal box he had just placed in his cart sat there as a bizarre symbol of the ordinary life he had been living just moments before. An ordinary life that was now being shattered by hatred he had done nothing to provoke. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He had not experienced this kind of open, aggressive racism directed at him personally in many years. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that such incidents were becoming relics of the past. Other shoppers in the aisle and in adjacent aisles stopped what they were doing. The sound of Margaret's screaming voice carried throughout that section of the store. A mother with 2 young children, perhaps 4 and 6 years old, quickly gathered her kids and hurried them away from the scene. She did not want them to hear or see what was unfolding. Her face was pale with shock as she rushed past other frozen shoppers. A teenage employee named Justin, who had been stocking shelves in the next aisle, pulled out his cell phone and began recording. His hands trembled slightly as he held up the device, capturing footage that would soon be viewed by millions. Margaret did not stop her tirade. If anything, she seemed energized by the attention she was drawing. She moved closer to Walter, abandoning her shopping cart entirely. Her voice grew louder and more aggressive with each passing second. She pointed her finger directly in Walter's face, coming within inches of touching him. She told him to go back to Africa. She screamed that black people like him were destroying the country. She accused him of purposely hitting her cart because he was planning to rob her. The accusations were bizarre, baseless, and delivered with such conviction that it was clear Margaret believed her own twisted narrative. Walter, displaying a level of composure that would later earn him widespread admiration, spoke calmly in response. His voice barely rose above its normal speaking volume. He asked her politely to please lower her voice. He assured her that he meant no harm to anyone. He said that there had been a simple misunderstanding and suggested they both go about their business peacefully. His dignified response, his refusal to engage with her hatred on her terms, seemed to infuriate Margaret even further. It was as though his calmness was an affront to her, a denial of the reaction she expected and perhaps wanted to provoke. By this point, several store employees had become aware of the disturbance. They converged on the breakfast foods aisle from different directions. The assistant manager on duty that day was a woman named Patricia Chen, who had worked at Greenfield Community Grocery for nearly 16 years. Patricia had dealt with difficult customers before, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she encountered when she arrived at the scene. The raw hatred in Margaret's voice was unlike anything Patricia had ever heard. She later described it as though she had stepped into a different era, a darker time in American history that she had only read about in books. Patricia approached Margaret and spoke in her most professional, calming tone. She asked Margaret to please calm down and suggested that perhaps they could discuss whatever the problem was in a more civilized manner. Margaret turned her fury on Patricia without hesitation. She made disparaging comments about Patricia's Asian heritage, telling her to go back to China and calling her names that do not bear repeating. Patricia stood her ground, though she later admitted that her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She informed Margaret that her behavior was unacceptable and that she needed to leave the store immediately. Margaret laughed at this demand. It was a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed through the now silent store. She declared that she was a paying customer and had every right to be there. She insisted that Walter was the one who should be removed because he had threatened her and made her feel unsafe. The absurdity of this claim, given what everyone present had witnessed, was almost surreal. Walter had done nothing but stand quietly and try to defuse the situation. He had not raised his voice, had not made any threatening gestures, had not done anything that could possibly be construed as aggressive or dangerous. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. More customers had gathered at the edges of the aisle, watching in horrified fascination. Multiple cell phones were now recording from various angles. The footage being captured would later be compiled to create a comprehensive visual record of the entire incident from start to finish. Patricia made the decision that she had no choice but to involve law enforcement. She stepped away briefly to radio the front of the store and instruct someone to call the police. Margaret heard this, and her reaction was unexpected. Instead of becoming concerned or attempting to moderate her behavior, she laughed again. She told Patricia that calling the police was the best idea anyone had had all day. She announced confidently that when the officers arrived, they would side with her because she was the real victim in this situation. She said she knew her rights and that she had done nothing wrong. She proclaimed that the police would arrest Walter for assault and that everyone who was recording would have evidence of a black man attacking a white woman. The delusion was complete. In Margaret's mind, she had constructed an entirely false narrative in which she was the innocent party and Walter was the aggressor. All this time, Walter remained standing in the same spot, leaning on his cane for support. Tears had begun to form in the corners of his eyes. He was a proud man, a veteran who had served his country with honor, a teacher who had dedicated his life to educating young people. And here he was, at 71 years old, being subjected to racist abuse by a stranger in a grocery store simply because he existed, simply because he had the audacity to shop for oatmeal while being black. The injustice of it all was overwhelming, and despite his best efforts to maintain his composure, the emotional toll was becoming visible. An elderly white woman who had been shopping in the next aisle made a decision in that moment that would make her a symbol of allyship and courage. Her name was Eleanor Patterson, and she was 78 years old. Eleanor had lived through the civil rights era. She had seen hatred like this before, decades ago, and she had hoped that those days were behind us. When she heard Margaret's tirade and saw Walter standing there alone, tears in his eyes, something inside her demanded action. She walked over and stood directly beside Walter. She placed her hand gently on his arm in a gesture of solidarity and support. Eleanor looked directly at Margaret and spoke in a clear, steady voice. She told Margaret that she should be deeply ashamed of herself. She said that attacking a man who had served this country honorably was despicable. She declared that racism like Margaret's had no place in their community or anywhere else. Eleanor's intervention was brave, especially given her advanced age and the volatility of the situation, but she felt compelled to act. She later told reporters that she could not stand by and watch another human being be dehumanized without doing something. Margaret was momentarily taken aback by Eleanor's intervention, but only momentarily. She quickly redirected her venomous words at Eleanor as well. She called Eleanor a traitor to her race. She used ugly language to describe Eleanor's decision to stand with a black man. She accused Eleanor of being part of the problem, of being someone who hated her own kind. Eleanor did not flinch. She stood her ground beside Walter, refusing to be intimidated. The police arrived within 6 minutes of the call being placed. 2 officers entered through the front of the store and were quickly directed to the breakfast foods aisle where the confrontation was still ongoing. These were experienced law enforcement professionals who had responded to countless disturbance calls over their careers. They had seen fights, arguments, drunken altercations, and every manner of public dispute. But both officers would later testify that what they encountered when they reached that aisle was unlike anything they had experienced before. Margaret was still ranting when the officers appeared. She had not stopped her verbal assault on Walter and Eleanor during the entire time they waited for law enforcement to arrive. The officers could hear her voice from halfway across the store. When they turned the corner into the aisle and saw the scene before them, their professional demeanors briefly cracked with visible shock. Here was a middle-aged white woman screaming the most hateful racist slurs at an elderly black man who was clearly a veteran based on his hat and who was leaning on a cane, obviously in need of support. One of the officers, a 12-year veteran of the force named Michael Rodriguez, stepped forward and addressed Margaret directly. He identified himself and his partner and asked Margaret to step outside the store so they could discuss the situation. His tone was professional but firm. He was giving Margaret an opportunity to remove herself from the situation calmly, to perhaps salvage some small portion of dignity from what had already become a disaster of her own making. Margaret refused. She refused multiple times, in fact, each refusal more defiant than the last. She insisted that the officers had no right to ask her to leave. She demanded that they arrest Walter instead. She claimed with absolute conviction that Walter had assaulted her with his shopping cart and had threatened her life. She pointed at Walter, who had still barely moved from his spot and had said almost nothing during the entire ordeal, and called him a dangerous criminal who should be locked up. The officers exchanged a glance. They had already begun to assess the situation. They could see the security camera mounted at the end of the aisle. They could see the multiple shoppers holding up cell phones, still recording. They could see the elderly black man standing quietly with tears in his eyes, supported by an equally elderly white woman who had her hand on his arm protectively. And they could see Margaret, red-faced and aggressive, hurling accusations that did not match anything observable about the scene before them. Officer Rodriguez informed Margaret that she was being detained for causing a disturbance. He explained that she was not under arrest at this point, but that she needed to step outside with them so they could sort out what had happened. He was still offering her a chance to cooperate, to handle this in a way that might minimize the consequences for her. It was a chance she threw away in the most dramatic fashion possible. When Officer Rodriguez reached out to guide Margaret toward the exit, she pushed him. It was not an accidental brush or an incidental contact. She placed both hands on his chest and shoved him backward with considerable force. The officer stumbled slightly but maintained his balance. The entire store seemed to hold its breath. Everyone watching knew that Margaret had just made an irreversible mistake. Assaulting a police officer is a serious criminal offense, and every person present had just witnessed it clearly. The officers immediately shifted into a more defensive posture. Officer Rodriguez's partner, a woman named Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had been on the force for 8 years, moved to assist in restraining Margaret. They informed her that she was now under arrest and ordered her to place her hands behind her back. Margaret did not comply. Instead, she began screaming even louder than before. She thrashed and struggled as the officers attempted to secure her. She continued yelling racial slurs not just at Walter now, but seemingly at everyone around her. She called Officer Rodriguez names based on his Latino heritage. She spat more hatred at the Asian assistant manager who was watching nearby. It took both officers several minutes of struggle to finally get the handcuffs secured on Margaret's wrists. Throughout the entire process, she never stopped resisting, never stopped screaming, never stopped spewing hatred. The cell phone videos captured every moment of it. The store's security cameras recorded it all in high definition. The evidence being accumulated was overwhelming and incontrovertible. As Margaret was finally secured and the officers began leading her toward the exit, she continued her tirade. She threatened to sue the store. She threatened to sue the police department. She threatened to sue every single person who had recorded her. She screamed that she was being arrested for being white and that this was reverse racism. She yelled that Walter should be the one in handcuffs, not her. Her voice echoed through the store as she was marched toward the front doors, attracting the attention of every shopper and employee in the building. Walter, meanwhile, had not moved. He stood in the breakfast foods aisle, leaning heavily on his cane, visibly shaken by what he had just experienced. Eleanor remained at his side, her hand still on his arm, providing what comfort she could. Patricia, the assistant manager, approached them with genuine concern etched on her face. Other customers who had witnessed the incident gathered around, offering words of support and expressing their disgust at what Margaret had done. One of the store's employees suggested that Walter should sit down, and someone quickly brought a chair from the customer service area. Walter lowered himself into it carefully, his hands trembling. Patricia called for paramedics to come check on him, worried about the physical toll the stress of the encounter might be taking on an elderly man with recent surgery. When the paramedics arrived a few minutes later, they found that Walter's blood pressure had spiked to concerning levels. His heart rate was elevated. His hands continued to shake even after he sat down. They spent nearly 20 minutes monitoring him and eventually recommended that he follow up with his regular doctor as soon as possible. The police officers conducted interviews at the scene before leaving. They spoke with Walter, who gave a quiet, measured account of what had happened. They spoke with Eleanor, who described Margaret's behavior in detail and praised Walter for his dignified response to such unprovoked hatred. They spoke with Patricia and several other employees. They spoke with multiple customers who had witnessed parts or all of the confrontation. They collected contact information from everyone who had recorded video on their phones. And they secured copies of the security camera footage from Patricia before leaving. The evidence was overwhelming. It was clear from every possible angle, from every witness account, from every piece of video evidence, that Walter had done absolutely nothing to provoke Margaret's attack. Her claims of being threatened or assaulted were complete fabrications, contradicted by every single piece of evidence that existed. Margaret was transported to the local police station. She was booked on multiple charges: disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The district attorney's office would later add a hate crime enhancement to several of the charges due to the explicitly racial nature of Margaret's verbal attack. This enhancement carried significant additional penalties under Massachusetts law. One of the teenagers who had recorded the incident posted his video on social media that same evening. The video was just under 4 minutes long and captured the heart of Margaret's racist tirade along with her subsequent arrest. Within hours, the video had gone viral. It was shared thousands of times, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Local news stations picked up the story overnight. By the next morning, it was being covered by regional and national media outlets. The hashtag created around the incident began trending on multiple social media platforms. People across the country watched the video with a mixture of horror and anger. Comments poured in expressing outrage at Margaret's behavior and sympathy for Walter. Many viewers were particularly moved by Walter's quiet dignity in the face of such vicious hatred, and by Eleanor's brave decision to stand beside him. The contrast between their grace and Margaret's ugliness could not have been more stark. Margaret's employer, a regional real estate company with offices throughout Massachusetts, moved quickly to distance themselves from her. Within 48 hours of the incident, the company issued a public statement announcing that Margaret had been immediately terminated from her position. The statement emphasized that the company had a zero-tolerance policy for racism and discrimination, and that Margaret's behavior was completely contrary to their values. They expressed their support for Walter and apologized that one of their former employees had subjected him to such treatment. I want to pause here and ask you something. Think about what you have heard so far. An elderly veteran, a man who served his country for 12 years and then spent decades educating young people, was attacked with vicious racial slurs while doing nothing more than shopping for groceries. What would you have done if you had been there? Would you have had the courage to stand beside him like Eleanor did? Would you have been one of the people recording, ensuring that evidence existed? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you are finding value in this story, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Stories like this need to be told, and your support helps us continue bringing them to you. The State Licensing Board for Real Estate Agents also took action. Within a week of the incident, they announced that Margaret's professional license had been suspended pending a full investigation. Given the clear video evidence and the criminal charges she was facing, few people doubted that the suspension would eventually become permanent. Margaret's career in real estate, which she had built over nearly 15 years, was effectively over. Her personal life was collapsing as well. Friends and family members began distancing themselves from her. People she had known for years stopped returning her calls. Her own sister gave a brief interview to a local news station in which she expressed shock and shame at Margaret's behavior. The sister said that while Margaret had always been difficult and sometimes short-tempered, she had never known her to be capable of something like this. The interview suggested a family torn apart by the public revelation of Margaret's racism. The legal proceedings began moving forward on an accelerated timeline, perhaps due to the intense public interest in the case. Margaret hired a defense attorney, a well-known criminal lawyer from Boston named Richard Sullivan. Sullivan's initial strategy was to argue that his client had been experiencing a mental health crisis at the time of the incident and should not be held fully responsible for her actions. He suggested that Margaret had been under extreme personal stress and had suffered what he called a psychological break. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Victoria Reyes, an assistant district attorney with a reputation for taking hate crimes extremely seriously. Reyes had prosecuted civil rights cases for over 15 years and had an impressive track record of securing convictions. When she reviewed the evidence in Margaret's case, she decided to pursue the maximum penalties allowed under state law. In a press conference, Reyes stated that racist attacks against elderly citizens would not be tolerated in their community and that her office intended to send a clear message that such behavior carried serious consequences. Margaret's preliminary hearing took place 4 weeks after the incident. She appeared in court dressed conservatively in a dark business suit, her hair neatly styled, her demeanor subdued. It was a dramatic transformation from the wild-eyed, screaming woman captured in the viral videos. Her attorney had clearly coached her on how to present herself, hoping to create a contrast between the person the jury would see in the courtroom and the person they had seen in the footage. The evidence presented at the preliminary hearing was damning beyond any reasonable doubt. The judge watched the security camera footage in its entirety, his face remaining expressionless, but his eyes occasionally widening at particularly egregious moments. He listened to testimony from Officer Rodriguez and Detective Mitchell, who described Margaret's behavior and her assault on Officer Rodriguez. He reviewed the written statements from multiple witnesses. At the conclusion of the hearing, the judge ruled that there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. He denied the defense's motion to reduce bail, noting that the evidence was among the most clear-cut he had seen in a hate crime case during his 22 years on the bench. Walter had initially been reluctant to speak publicly about what happened. He was a private man who had never sought attention or fame. The sudden spotlight thrust upon him by the viral video was uncomfortable and unwelcome. But after several weeks of reflection and after receiving encouragement from family, friends, and community members, he agreed to give one interview to a local news station. The interview aired on a Tuesday evening and drew record viewership for the station's local news broadcast. Walter sat in his modest living room, his wife of 45 years seated beside him, and spoke with the same quiet dignity he had displayed in the grocery store. He talked about his life, his service in the Navy, his 30 years as a teacher. He spoke about the young people he had taught over the decades, students of all races and backgrounds who had gone on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers themselves, contributing members of society. Then he spoke about the incident. He described his confusion when Margaret began screaming at him. He said he had simply been shopping for cereal and could not understand why this woman he had never met hated him so intensely. He talked about the fear he felt when she moved closer and became more aggressive. He admitted that he had experienced moments of racism throughout his life, especially growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, but he had hoped that society had moved beyond such open, aggressive hatred. This incident, he said, reminded him that while progress had been made, there was still work to be done. The interview made Walter a sympathetic figure throughout the region and beyond. People who watched it were moved by his grace and his refusal to respond to hatred with hatred. A crowdfunding campaign started by members of his church without his knowledge raised over $55,000 to help with any medical or legal expenses he might incur. Walter was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He ultimately decided to keep only a small portion of the funds for his own needs and donated the rest to organizations that combat racism and support elderly citizens. Margaret's legal troubles continued to mount. Beyond the criminal charges, Walter filed a civil lawsuit against her for emotional distress and the physical health impacts of the incident. His attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Marcus Johnson, who had taken the case pro bono, argued that the stress from the encounter had caused significant deterioration in Walter's health. Medical records documented that Walter had developed high blood pressure issues requiring new medication. He had begun experiencing difficulty sleeping and suffered from nightmares about the incident. He developed anxiety about going to public places, a dramatic change for a man who had always been social and community-oriented. The criminal trial began in January 2026, approximately 4 months after the incident. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and protesters on the first day. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity with reporters, community members, civil rights advocates, and members of the public who had followed the case closely. The story had become a national talking point about racism, accountability, and justice. Margaret sat at the defense table looking nothing like the aggressive woman in the videos. She had lost weight during the months since her arrest. Her face looked drawn and tired. Her attorney sat beside her, a stack of files and legal documents before him. The prosecution table was equally prepared, with Victoria Reyes and her team ready to present their case. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They began by playing the security camera footage for the jury. The footage was shown on large screens positioned so that both the jury and the gallery could see clearly. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret's voice filled the room, every racial slur captured in crystal-clear audio. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others watched with expressions of barely concealed disgust. After the video, the prosecution called their witnesses. One by one, shoppers who had been present that day took the stand and described what they had seen and heard. They spoke about the fear and shock they felt witnessing Margaret's racist tirade. They described Walter's calm, dignified response and Margaret's escalating aggression. A mother testified about grabbing her young children and rushing them away from the scene because she did not want them exposed to such hatred. The officers who arrested Margaret testified next. Officer Rodriguez described approaching Margaret and giving her multiple opportunities to leave peacefully. He testified about her refusal to comply, her increasingly aggressive behavior, and finally her physical assault on him. He described the struggle to restrain her as she continued screaming racial slurs at everyone around her. Detective Mitchell corroborated his account and added details about Margaret's behavior during transport to the station, where she continued making racist statements and insisted that Walter should have been the one arrested. Medical professionals who had treated Walter testified about his condition following the incident. His physician described the spike in blood pressure that had required new medication. A psychologist who had evaluated Walter testified about symptoms consistent with trauma, including nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance in public spaces. The testimony painted a picture of an elderly man whose peaceful retirement had been shattered by a random encounter with hatred. Then Walter himself took the stand. The courtroom grew completely still as the elderly veteran made his way slowly to the witness chair, leaning on his cane. He wore a suit that was perhaps slightly too large for him, suggesting he had lost weight since the incident. He settled into the chair and looked out at the courtroom with an expression of quiet resolve. Under questioning from the prosecutor, Walter described the events of that day in a clear, steady voice. He talked about driving to the store, walking through the aisles, standing in front of the oatmeal display. He described the moment when Margaret's cart touched his and his instinctive apology. He recounted the confused shock he felt when she began screaming at him. He described standing frozen as her hateful words washed over him, unable to understand why this stranger hated him so intensely. Walter's testimony was powerful because of its simplicity and honesty. He did not exaggerate or embellish. He did not demonize Margaret beyond describing what she had actually done. He simply told the truth about what he experienced that day. The fear, the confusion, the humiliation, the tears he could not hold back. He talked about the aftermath, the nightmares, the anxiety about going to public places that he had frequented for decades without incident. He talked about feeling like his years of service to his country and his community meant nothing to people who saw him only as a black man to be despised. Several jury members were visibly emotional during Walter's testimony. One woman wiped tears from her eyes. A man in the back row of the jury box shook his head slowly, his expression one of profound sadness. The impact of hearing directly from the victim, of seeing this dignified elderly veteran describe the trauma inflicted upon him, was immeasurable. The defense attorney's cross-examination of Walter was careful and brief. Richard Sullivan clearly recognized that aggressively questioning an elderly veteran who had been victimized would only alienate the jury further. He asked a few questions, trying to establish that the initial cart contact might have been Walter's fault, but Walter's consistent, credible account left no room for doubt. Sullivan also tried to suggest that perhaps Walter had misheard some of what Margaret said. But this line of questioning collapsed when the prosecutor pointed out that everything was captured clearly on video. The defense's case was built primarily on the argument that Margaret had experienced some kind of psychological episode. Sullivan called a psychiatrist who testified that Margaret had been under significant stress at the time of the incident due to problems in her personal life. The psychiatrist suggested that this stress, combined with other factors, might have caused her to behave in ways that were out of character for her. But then Sullivan made what many legal experts would later call a critical mistake. He put Margaret on the stand. The decision was born of desperation. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and Sullivan apparently hoped that having Margaret speak directly to the jury might humanize her and generate some sympathy. Margaret testified that she had been going through an extremely difficult time in her life during the period leading up to the incident. She claimed she was having problems in her marriage and was under intense pressure at work. She said she did not clearly remember everything she said that day and suggested that the videos made it look worse than it actually was. She insisted that she was not a racist person and that what happened that day did not represent who she truly was. She mentioned that she had black acquaintances and colleagues and had never done anything like this before. The cross-examination by Victoria Reyes was methodical and absolutely devastating. Reyes played specific portions of the video, pausing at particular moments, and asked Margaret to explain exactly what she meant when she said specific racist phrases. She asked Margaret why, if she was so stressed and out of control that she did not know what she was doing, she was able to articulate such specific, detailed racist insults. She asked Margaret to explain her statement that Walter should go back to Africa if she was not a racist person. She asked why Margaret told Patricia, the assistant manager, to go back to China. She asked why Margaret pushed Officer Rodriguez if she was genuinely sorry and wanted to cooperate. Margaret had no good answers. As the cross-examination continued, she became increasingly defensive and argumentative. Her face flushed red. Her voice rose. The calm, composed woman who had taken the stand began to crack, revealing glimpses of the angry, aggressive person captured in the videos. The jury watched this transformation with great interest. They were seeing, in real time, that the person presented by the defense was a facade, and that the real Margaret Holloway was much closer to the woman screaming racial slurs in a grocery store. It was a disaster for the defense, perhaps the worst self-inflicted wound in any trial the courthouse had seen in years. The trial lasted 7 days. The prosecution's closing argument summarized the overwhelming evidence and emphasized the harm that racist attacks cause not just to direct victims, but to entire communities. The defense's closing argument was a last-ditch attempt to humanize Margaret and argue that she had already suffered enough through the loss of her career and reputation. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning. When the foreman announced that they had reached a verdict, the courtroom fell absolutely silent. The word came, guilty on all counts. Guilty of disorderly conduct with a hate crime enhancement. Guilty of resisting arrest. Guilty of assault on a police officer. The jury foreman later spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse. He said that the decision was one of the most straightforward the jury had ever faced. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. There was no reasonable doubt about what Margaret had done or why she had done it. The only deliberation that took any significant time was ensuring that they had properly considered every element of every charge. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the State Real Estate Licensing Board conducted its own proceeding and permanently revoked Margaret's license. Her career in real estate was officially and irrevocably over. She would never again be able to work in the field she had spent 15 years building. The sentencing hearing drew even more public attention than the trial itself. The courthouse was surrounded by news vans and crowds of people. Inside, every seat in the gallery was filled. The judge presiding over the case, a veteran of the bench with over 25 years of experience, was known for thoughtful but firm sentencing, particularly in cases involving hate crimes. Before announcing the sentence, the judge allowed Walter to deliver a victim impact statement. Walter rose slowly from his seat in the gallery and made his way to the podium at the front of the courtroom. He leaned his cane against the podium and adjusted the microphone slightly. Then he began to speak. Walter talked about how the incident had fundamentally changed his life. He described the fear and anxiety he now experienced in situations where he had always felt comfortable before. He talked about the sadness of knowing that someone could hate him so intensely simply because of the color of his skin without knowing anything about him as a person. He talked about his 12 years of service in the Navy, the decades he spent teaching young people of all races and backgrounds, his contributions to his community over a long lifetime. He said that Margaret's attack made him feel as though none of that mattered to people who saw him only as a black man. But Walter also spoke about forgiveness and hope. He said he did not hate Margaret, even though what she did to him was hateful. He expressed his hope that society could learn from this incident and continue working toward a world where people are judged by their character rather than their appearance. He said he still believed in the fundamental goodness of most people and was grateful for those who had stood beside him, like Eleanor, and those who had supported him since. When Walter finished speaking, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Even several of the court officers were visibly moved. The judge thanked Walter for his statement and commended him for his extraordinary dignity throughout the entire ordeal. Then the judge addressed Margaret directly. His voice was stern and measured. He spoke about the seriousness of her crimes and the profound impact of her actions. He noted that she had shown little genuine remorse throughout the legal proceedings and had attempted to minimize her behavior at every opportunity. He said that racially motivated attacks against senior citizens were particularly despicable because they targeted individuals who were vulnerable and who had already contributed so much to society. The judge spoke about the broader implications of hate crimes. He said they tear at the fabric of communities and make members of targeted groups feel unsafe and unwelcome in spaces that should belong to everyone equally. He said that such crimes must be met with serious consequences to deter others and to affirm society's commitment to equal dignity for all people. He noted that Walter had served his country honorably, had educated generations of young people, and deserved to be able to shop for groceries in peace without being subjected to racist abuse. The sentence was severe. For the assault on a police officer, the most serious of the charges, Margaret received 2.5 years in jail. For the hate crime enhancement on the disorderly conduct charge, she received an additional 18 months. The sentences were to run consecutively, meaning Margaret would serve a total of 4 years behind bars. But the judge was not finished. He also imposed a fine of $85,000, one of the largest fines ever imposed for such charges in that county. The fine was directed to a fund that supports victims of hate crimes and organizations working to combat racism. The amount represented both the seriousness of the offense and the judge's determination to impose meaningful financial consequences. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Margaret's face went pale. Her attorney immediately stood and requested that the judge reconsider the fine amount, arguing that it was excessive and would cause undue financial hardship. The judge denied the request without hesitation. He said the fine was entirely appropriate given the severity of Margaret's actions, the clear evidence of her racial motivation, and her complete lack of genuine remorse. Margaret was immediately taken into custody to begin serving her sentence. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the reality of what her actions had cost her was finally fully apparent. She would spend the next 4 years of her life behind bars, all because she could not control her racist hatred during a brief encounter in a grocery store. The civil lawsuit filed by Walter was settled outside of court approximately 4 months after the criminal trial concluded. The details of the settlement were confidential, but court records indicated that Margaret's insurance covered a portion of the damages and that she was personally responsible for paying Walter an additional $70,000. Combined with the criminal fine of $85,000, Margaret owed well over $155,000 as a direct result of her racist tirade in a grocery store. Legal experts who analyzed the case praised it as a model for how hate crimes should be prosecuted. The combination of criminal penalties, civil damages, and professional consequences created what one scholar called a comprehensive accountability framework. Others noted that the case demonstrated the power of video evidence in securing hate crime convictions and the importance of bystanders who document such incidents. Greenfield Community Grocery used the incident as an opportunity for positive change. The ownership implemented mandatory anti-racism and de-escalation training for all employees. They created clear protocols for handling harassment incidents, ensuring that staff would know exactly how to respond if anything similar ever occurred. They installed additional security cameras and hired trained security personnel. They posted prominent signage affirming their commitment to being a welcoming space for all community members regardless of race, religion, national origin, or background. Patricia Chen, the assistant manager who had responded to the incident with such professionalism, was praised widely for her conduct. The company promoted her to store manager, gave her a substantial raise, and eventually made her a regional trainer responsible for teaching other managers how to handle discrimination incidents. She became a sought-after speaker on how businesses should respond to racism and harassment. The 2 police officers who arrested Margaret received commendations from their department. Officer Rodriguez and Detective Mitchell were recognized for their professionalism in handling an extremely volatile and emotionally charged situation. Their conduct during the arrest, which was captured clearly on video, was cited as an example of proper de-escalation techniques. The department began using footage from the incident in training sessions for new officers. The impact of the case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The viral videos and subsequent trial sparked conversations across Massachusetts and throughout the country about racism, accountability, and bystander intervention. Community organizations held town halls and forums to discuss combating racism. Churches, schools, and civic groups used the case as a starting point for difficult but necessary conversations. Several state legislators cited the case when introducing or supporting hate crime legislation. One bill, which passed the following year, increased penalties for hate crimes committed against elderly victims. Supporters of the legislation explicitly referenced Walter's experience as evidence of the need for stronger "no one would believe" how bad it was based on a secondhand description alone. He said he had never witnessed anything like that before and was genuinely shocked that someone would attack an elderly man so viciously. While some criticized him for posting the video without consent, most people praised his decision as essential to ensuring that justice was served. Without his video and the videos of other bystanders, the case would have come down to conflicting accounts with no clear evidence. Margaret served her full 4-year sentence without early release. During her time in the correctional facility, she was required to participate in counseling programs and educational sessions about racism and anger management. Reports that emerged after her release indicated that she remained largely uncooperative throughout her incarceration. She allegedly maintained to other inmates and to staff that she was the real victim and had been treated unfairly by the justice system. She reportedly showed little evidence of genuine remorse or personal growth. Upon her release in September 2029, Margaret faced a devastated life. Her criminal conviction for a hate crime made finding employment in any professional field essentially impossible. Background checks immediately revealed her record, and no reputable employer would hire her. She had lost her home during her incarceration because she was unable to make mortgage payments while in prison. Her personal relationships had been destroyed by the scandal. Her marriage had ended in divorce. Friends and family members who had not already abandoned her did so while she was incarcerated. She filed for bankruptcy shortly after her release, but the court ruled that the debts she owed to Walter could not be discharged. She would remain legally obligated to pay him for the foreseeable future. The case of Margaret Holloway became a permanent fixture in legal databases and a reference point for discussions about hate crimes and their consequences. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that a few minutes of hateful behavior can result in years of consequences that destroy every aspect of a person's life. It served as a warning to anyone who might consider expressing racist hatred publicly that the costs of such behavior have never been higher. Walter continued to live his quiet life, though it was forever changed by what happened. In interviews given on subsequent anniversaries of the incident, he consistently expressed the same message: treat people with kindness and respect regardless of their background or appearance. He said that racism hurts everyone, not just its direct victims, and that we all have a responsibility to stand against it when we see it. He remained active in his church and community, speaking occasionally to groups about his experience and about the importance of dignity and grace in the face of hatred. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly white woman who stood beside Walter during the incident, became something of a folk hero in the community. She was invited to speak at numerous events about allyship and the importance of standing up for others. She consistently deflected praise, saying that she simply did what any decent person should do when they see someone being treated unjustly. But her example inspired many others to consider how they might respond if they ever witnessed similar behavior. The security footage from that day in September 2025 serves as a stark reminder of important truths about our modern world. We live in an age where actions are often recorded and shared, where behavior that might once have gone unwitnessed and unaccountable is now captured and preserved. People who choose hatred over humanity may find themselves held accountable in ways that previous generations never experienced. The cameras are always watching, and the public's appetite for justice, while sometimes imperfect in its expression, is real and powerful. Every person who watched the video, attended the trial, or followed the story was reminded of something fundamental. We all have choices in how we treat others. Margaret Holloway chose hatred and paid an enormous price that destroyed her career, her finances, her freedom, her relationships, and her reputation. Walter Morrison chose dignity and grace, even in the face of vicious abuse, and earned the respect and admiration of an entire community. The final accounting of Margaret's consequences is staggering in its totality. 4 years in jail, over $155,000 in fines and damages, a permanently revoked professional license, a criminal record that will follow her for the rest of her life, a destroyed marriage, abandonment by friends and family, loss of her home, bankruptcy, a reputation reduced to ashes. All of this stemming from a few minutes of racist harassment directed at an elderly African-American veteran who was simply trying to buy groceries for his wife. This case proves that justice, while sometimes slow and imperfect, can prevail. It shows that communities, legal systems, and ordinary people armed with camera phones can work together to hold individuals accountable for hateful behavior. It demonstrates that victims of harassment deserve support, recognition, and compensation for the harm they endure. And it affirms that racism, while still present in our society, will not be tolerated when it reveals itself so openly. The story of what happened at Greenfield Community Grocery on that Wednesday afternoon in September 2025 is tragic, infuriating, and ultimately a testament to the power of accountability. It reminds us that racism has no place in our society, and that those who choose to express it publicly should expect to face serious consequences. For Walter, an elderly African-American veteran who just wanted to buy oatmeal, the incident was a traumatic experience that altered the course of his retirement years. But his response to that trauma, with grace, dignity, and a call for understanding rather than vengeance, showed the world what true character looks like. For Margaret, a woman who allowed her racist hatred to control her actions for just a few minutes, those minutes cost her everything she had built in her life. Her story serves as a warning to anyone who might consider treating another human being with contempt and cruelty simply because of their race. The message could not be clearer. Racism is not just morally wrong, but extraordinarily costly in every possible way. In an age where actions are recorded and shared instantaneously, where communities demand accountability, and where justice systems are increasingly willing to take hate crimes seriously, there is nowhere to hide from the consequences of hateful behavior. If you found this story powerful and important, please share it with others. Stories like this need to be told so that we can learn from them and work together toward building a better society. If you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss our future content. We bring you real stories that matter, stories about justice and injustice, about courage and cowardice, about the best and worst of human nature. Thank you so much for watching, and please remember to treat everyone you encounter with respect and kindness. You never know when a simple moment of patience could prevent a tragedy, or when a moment of hatred could destroy a life.